Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I have a topic I want to dive into, and that is the ketogenic diet. There was a review paper from the ISSN, and I just want to go over some of the findings and then my thoughts on the ketogenic diet and where it can be useful, and do I find it useful, and is it something I use with clients, and then just some issues that I potentially see with it. So we'll dive into that. First, before I do that, I am a little under the weather. My wife was sick over the weekend with COVID, and I was hoping I was in the clear, but I think I'm at least getting some sort of symptoms with it. But hey, still got to show up for you guys and get this done. And again, it's not anything that was going to be detrimental, but I may be a little bit slower. So if you hear that, I apologize ahead of time, but we should be good to go here. So anyways, I want to dive into this paper. So again, it's the International Society of Sports Nutrition Position Stand Ketogenic Diets. So again, that's the ISSN. They do a ton of research papers. I actually had the co-founder, Dr. Jose Antonio on. That podcast should be out in a couple of weeks. We don't talk about this specifically, but he is a part of that organization. And so the position statement is the ISSN provides an objective and critical review of the use of ketogenic diet in healthy exercising adults with a focus on exercise performance and body composition. So that's what we're going to focus on here is exercise performance and body composition. And they do mention that they do not address the use of exogenous ketone supplements, again, taking any sort of ketone supplements there. So again, I think that this is important to go over because this is a diet that, again, is very, very popular and something that people will use mostly to lose weight. So we are definitely going to have a huge body composition component to this. But again, going over the performance side of things, I think can also be super important here. Again, just understand that this is a diet, right? This is a diet that is going to be basically high fat, low carbohydrate. They actually mentioned, so a ketogenic diet induces a state of nutritional ketosis, which is generally defined as serum ketone levels above 0.5, while many factors can impact that amount of daily what amount of daily carbohydrate intake will result in these levels. A broad guideline is a daily dietary carbohydrate intake of less than 50 grams per day. Okay, so you're looking at basically that's maybe a little bit of fruit and then some veggies, right? And that's basically all you're getting from a carbohydrate standpoint. You're not really going to be able to have anything else. That takes out an entire food group, right? This takes out a lot of things. And I want to plant that seed now because we'll definitely come back to this. But let's think about it, right? All your kind of tasty foods, carbohydrates in them, but they also have fats. But because people can't have carbohydrates, this takes out a big chunk of calorie dense foods. You can't have pizza with this. You can't have cookies. You can't have cake. Again, people are like, yeah, that's the carbs, but it's not the carbs, right? It's that combination of fat and that combination of added sugar, aka carbohydrates, in this that makes those foods just super calorie dense and really can add up. The calories can add up. You completely cut all those out, right? No rice, no potatoes, no tortillas, no pasta, any of those things. We're just looking at less than 50 grams a day of dietary carbohydrate. I also briefly wanted to go over what is ketosis. It's a metabolic state where the body burns fat for fuel instead of carbohydrates. It produces ketones as a byproduct. And people will hear that and they hear burning fat and they think that means that they're going to drop body fat, right? But that's not the case. That's just the fuel source your body is using. So again, if you don't get into a energy deficit where you're expending more calories than you are bringing in, it doesn't matter if you're using fat as the main fuel source. That caloric intake is still going to be the thing that's going to tell the body whether it needs to get rid of body fat or maintain it or potentially store it down the line. So again, that's super important. It's the same thing as alcohol, right? People are like, oh, if you have alcohol, doesn't that mean you're not burning fat during that period of time? And yes, when you consume alcohol, your body's main goal is to get rid of that alcohol from your system. And so that's going to be its main job. So yeah, it's not using fat as a fuel source then. However, if that, consuming that alcohol intake for or whatever you had for the entire day still puts you in, say, a maintenance of calories or a surplus of calories, that's still going to be the deciding factor. It's not what fuel source your body is using, right? So I think that's super important to go over because people overlook that. And again, that's going to be a nugget another seed that I'm planting here with this paper. So again, we know that 50 grams per day is less than 50 grams per day is typically what people are going to do here from a ketogenic diet standpoint. So that cuts out a lot of foods. Again, this high fat, low carb induces a state of ketosis. And again, that's done through carbohydrate restriction and a high dietary fat intake. But that doesn't mean that is going to automatically burn body fat and you're going to use body fat as a source of calories and energy, right? You still need to have less energy coming in than what your body is. And again, if you cut out a lot of these calorie dense foods, that could make it easier to happen. So you can see where people do that, and then they're like, oh, it's because I'm burning fat now, and it's you're consuming a lot less calories there. But we'll talk about how you can still overshoot it. They do mention that this is not intrinsically harmful, and it should not be confused with ketoacidosis, right? That's a life-threatening condition most commonly seen in clinical populations in metabolic dysregulation, right? So that's not the same thing. Ketosis is different than that. So that's been an overview of it in terms of just some things you need to know about it there. One finding they had was a ketogenic diet has largely neutral or detrimental effects on athletic performance compared to a diet higher in carbohydrates and lower in fat, despite achieving significantly elevated levels of fat oxidation during exercise. And this makes sense to me. So it's so neutral. So for some people, it's not any worse. It's the same, which again could be a positive for some people, and it could have detrimental effects on athletic performance, right? So again, we're probably talking more like endurance type events, and then any other type of sports. Just because again, it's going to require glucose, and we want to make sure that we have enough glycogen. So again, a lack of carbohydrates can really impact that, and can really impact your performance in anything, right? Whether that's a long distance cardio event, any sort of sports performance, anything like that, right? So again, the research shows that it has largely neutral or detrimental. So nothing that shows that it's going to be superior to a low carbohydrate diet. So that right there tells me it's okay. Is this going to be the best, from that standpoint? So if you're somebody who is fairly active, is pretty active, does a couple cardio sessions per week, you do play a sport, say once a week, and then you do some weight training, is this going to be the best diet from a performance standpoint? Probably not, right? So again, we want to keep that in mind. The endurance effects of a ketogenic diet may be influenced by both training status and duration of the dietary intervention, but further research is necessary to elucidate these possibilities. All studies involving elite athletes showed a performance decrement from a ketogenic diet, all lasting 6 weeks or less. Of the two studies lasting more than 6 weeks, only one reported a statistically significant benefit of a ketogenic diet. So again, elite athletes, which makes sense, right? I think if you take somebody who maybe is overweight, they don't really have good cardiovascular health, and you have them go out, and the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet probably isn't really going to impact their performance. But as they progress, this is where you may start to see it impact things there. And now again, these were 6 weeks or less, right? So you need to be keto adapted potentially, but of the two studies lasting more than 6 weeks, only one reported a statistically significant benefit of a ketogenic diet. So maybe there is something to potentially being keto adapted, right? A ketogenic diet tends to have similar effects on maximal strength or strength gains from a resistance training program compared to a diet higher in carbohydrates, which makes sense just because strength training is usually, 1 to 3 reps. It's not a lot of reps. You really don't need like glycogen. You don't really need carbohydrates for that. So to me, this makes sense that if calories are equated, that's going to be the most important factor here. And you don't necessarily need a high carbohydrate diet for strength, right? Again, this kind of lower training volume, lower rep type of training. However, a minority of studies show superior effects of non-ketogenic comparators. Again, some studies are showing that higher carbohydrate is going to be superior, right? So and so when it comes to people, again, the type of training that I'm usually going to have clients do is more hypertrophy style. So it is going to be a little bit higher volume. And for them, I think a low carbohydrate diet is going to impact your strength, right? I just think even just being in an energy deficit, usually where it impacts me is like towards the end of the set and like the end of the workouts, right? You just start to gas out and you're not really able to put everything in, and you start to fatigue a little bit quicker, right? And that's where I think it can impact things from a muscle building standpoint, right? You're going to be missing out on, that little bit extra volume. And again, maybe in the absolute short term, it's not a big deal, but over time, if you're doing low carbohydrate, more ketogenic style, I think it is going to impact your muscle building side of things, right? And the studies do show that when compared to a diet higher in carbohydrates and lower in fat, a ketogenic diet may cause greater losses in body weight. Okay, so that's a win for the ketogenic diet. Fat mass, again, that's a big win, and fat-free mass. But it may also heighten losses of lean tissue, which again is not going to be great from a muscle building standpoint, right? We definitely want to make sure we hold on to lean tissue. However, they do mention that this is likely due to differences in calorie and protein intake, as well as shifts in fluid balance. Obviously, for taking body comp measurements here, there is a large fluid water component to it. And if we're cutting out carbohydrates, that is going to lower the water retention. It's going to lower glycogen, which is that does show up as lean tissue. And so you could see where maybe that's what's going on there, right? This is to say that we can't say for sure. However, again, it does seem to show that it may heighten losses of lean tissue. But again, the differences in calorie and protein intake are super important. So this is again where we obviously know that a calorie deficit is not going to be great for building, maintaining muscle. The size of that deficit is super important. So the larger the deficit, the less food you're eating overall, the worse it is for building muscle for sure. You're not going to be able to build it, but then even maintaining muscle potentially. And then on top of it, protein intake is also super important. If we're going low protein in this process, we're in a really large calorie deficit. That's where things are going to start to add up here with this. And then there's insufficient evidence to determine if a ketogenic diet affects males and females differently. However, there's a strong mechanistic basis for sex difference to exist in response to a ketogenic diet, but more research needs to be done there. So I just want to hit on those last couple points here real quick, okay? Muscular strength summary. So ketogenic diets do not appear to affect strength training performance differently from controlled diets, which are higher in carbohydrates. Notably, this includes both acute performance and strength gains that occur over 4 to 12 weeks of resistance training. Caution is warranted since a minority studies indeed show superior effects of a higher carbohydrate comparator for improving or retaining strength performance. Furthermore, there's a lack of trials exceeding 12 weeks involving highly trained strength athletes. Cautious monitoring of individual response is recommended for strength athletes choosing a ketogenic diet due to its potential to suboptimize training adaptations in the long term there, right? Really, to me, what that means is, okay, so some of these studies are showing that it may not be detrimental. However, there's not much over 12 weeks. So then it's all right, is that going to be something that could potentially impact things over time? And again, I think to be safe, we probably don't want, if our goal is performance, a ketogenic diet is likely going to be superior here for this is really my main takeaway from that. And then I want to go over the body composition summary. So a ketogenic diet reduces body weight, body fat, and fat-free mass more than controlled diets higher in carbohydrate among active adults and athletes. Changes in fat-free mass are more disparate with a similar number of studies, indicating greater losses of fat-free mass when following a ketogenic diet as a number of studies that showed negligible changes in fat-free mass. But as they talked about, these results may be influenced by alterations in body fluid, increases in protein intake, and reductions in calorie intake with ketogenic diets. Further research in which there is strict control over the diet is needed to disentangle how a ketogenic diet impacts the body composition of active adults and athletes. So again, it's probably going to help decrease body fat. It can be a great tool to help do that. It can obviously drop weight, but again, from a lean body mass perspective, probably not going to be the best long-term there. So I lastly want to hit on the sex differences. So in recent years, there has been an increased interest in using ketogenic diets to improve endurance exercise capacity through a shift towards a primary use of fatty acids and ketones as a fuel source. However, the viability of this diet in female athletes for long-term performance and health has yet to be established. So again, we don't know, just understand that we don't know for sure, but from the few studies that have been conducted, it appears that ketogenic diet has a relatively greater benefit in males with regard to metabolic shifts and body composition changes. Further research in females is needed to determine the full effect of a ketogenic diet on performance, body composition, appetite regulations, and overall health outcomes. So again, for body composition, keto diet appear to be superior to higher carbohydrate diets for reducing body weight and fat mass, but they are suboptimal for increasing fat-free mass. So again, I think it comes back to this kind of diet style it makes it easier to get into a energy deficit versus, if you don't have an entire food group that you're cutting out, essentially, again, it can be easy to let all these extra calories come in. So that's the review of that paper. I think really the summary was, hey, from a performance standpoint, probably not going to be great. Can't help with a weight loss, fat mass side of things. But like I said, I think that's, again, something that is more calorie related than the actual diet itself. And then from a strength standpoint or sex difference standpoint, there is some benefit or some research that shows it may be a little bit more beneficial for men than women, which again, I find that a lot of my female clients that come to me, they are very low carbohydrate. And that is something that we try to work on. We don't obviously want to increase their carbs a ton, but I do find that that is the macronutrient that is very low. And I think that just comes back to, that's just what has been put out there for women, right? That's just what's been marketed to them. Again, I'm not saying that women need to be high carbohydrate, but I think making sure that you're not going very low carbohydrate is key. This is my thoughts on it, right? So first, it's not needed. Okay. Based on all this, it's not needed. I think that comes back to hey, this is not magic. There's no magic to it other than, like I've talked about throughout, it cuts out an entire food group, and it's going to cut out it's going to cut out a food group that, again, when also combined with, sorry, I'm drawing a blank here and this is me being sick, but when combined with, again, fats, that's the calorie density. Those are the calories that are easy to consume, right? Like you're going to consume a lot of extra calories because of that. So I think that's where it can be helpful, right? It cuts out that food group and you just because that's a lot of potential calories out there, right? So I think that's a big thing, is understanding it's not needed. It can be helpful for some people to drop some weight, but I think from a body composition standpoint, it's probably not something that we would do on there, but I'll talk about where, again, it could be useful. Also, I think one thing that's important to note is the fat source. A lot of times when people do keto diets, it's usually very high in saturated fat, right? They'll do a lot of bacon, a lot of pork, like a lot of like fatty meats and stuff like that, which again, I think some of that's fine, but if that's the only way, like a lot of cheese, a lot of butter, a lot of these saturated, high saturated fats. And again, like I said, I think some of that is fine, but we have to be careful if that's only where our fat sources are coming. We need to make sure we include things like avocados, nuts and seeds, olive oil, fatty fish, coconut oil. These are the types of fats that we want to add in. And I think most people, when they do a ketogenic diet, they don't add in those fats. And yes, from a calorie standpoint, that may help. But again, I think from an overall health standpoint, probably not the greatest. So if this is something you are going to try, definitely make sure you throw in these types of fats. Another issue I have with it is obviously the muscle building issues. I place a huge priority on body composition. So, again, I think that this is something where if you're relatively lean or maybe you're just like moderate body fat, I don't think this is a good thing for you from a body composition standpoint. I don't think you need to go into you don't need to do a keto diet for this reason, right? I don't think you need to do a keto diet in general for any reason, but especially if body composition is your main goal in performance. But I definitely think that if you have moderate amount of body fat or less, I don't think it's a great idea, right? And again, that comes to the muscle building side of things, but also the maintenance of lean body mass as well too. Again, another issue I have is just restricting one food source. That can just be really challenging, and mentally it can lead to people having like poor relationships with certain foods, right? So again, carbs are bad. We can't have carbs. And again, that's not a great place to be, right? All foods, all macros have their place, and it's all about moderation. It's all about how does it fit in. And again, I think to demonize one macronutrient is wrong, and that's not going to help anybody out. And again, it's not flexible because of that. And so this is why I'm not a huge fan of trying to get somebody to eat one particular diet. It's, hey, look at your overall intake. Let's make sure we're getting a good base of protein in, a good base of whole foods. And then let's watch, hey, are you maybe a little bit higher on fats? Are you a little bit lower? Are you a little bit higher on carbs, a little bit too low? And finding that sweet spot for them. And again, making sure that they are getting a good base of whole foods in their diet. I think and then having some flexibility and not having this like, oh, hey, you can't have this food, you can't have that food. Because again, I don't think that is helpful. So again, from a practical application standpoint, I'll never use this straight up for any client. I've never once been like, hey, I think we should try keto. What we'll do is, again, maybe we'll go a little bit lower carbohydrate during a fat loss diet. But again, we're trying to manipulate calories there, right? And unfortunately, you have to get rid of some macronutrient. And so fats, you definitely don't want to go super low with fats. You want to have a nice minimum there. Protein, you obviously want to have a minimum there. So unfortunately, that's where we end up seeing the change here, is mostly in carbohydrates. But I really try to avoid getting them too low. But for some people where their calories have to get fairly low in a fat loss diet, that may happen, right? It just may be something that happens. And but again, we'll never like purposely be like, hey, you don't go over 50 grams of carbohydrates, right? And so I think it can be great to get weight loss started for people maybe who are overweight. It can help get things moving in the right direction and can build some forward momentum with that, right? And because they have higher levels of body fat, I'm not overly concerned about muscle loss so long as they do some resistance training. And again, they just have a lot of extra energy reserve to where I'm not overly concerned about muscle loss. And I think it'd be helpful. Again, I think with carbohydrates, we need to base it off of how active somebody is. If you're not very active, you don't really need as many carbohydrates, right? So again, that's another thing that we're going to throw in. But for that person, for getting started with weight loss, after that point, I think we need to find a way that is going to help you maintain any sort of weight loss. And again, I think cutting out an entire food group, while can be done, it's going to be very challenging for many people. You're pretty much, if you go to any sort of event, it's like you have to 95% of the foods are out. And so that can just be very challenging. So this is where it's, hey, I like to promote that kind of flexible lifestyle, but to get things rolling, this may be a great thing to get started for somebody. But for maximizing body comp, it's a thumbs down for me. And it's not something I would use for somebody who, again, has moderate to low amounts of body fat, really wants to maximize muscle growth. And again, only in the short term would I think about using keto for somebody who's overweight. But again, that's just a very short-term thing. And then we would slowly want to introduce other types of foods, right? Again, I think at the end of the day, to really sum this up, there's nothing special about the keto diet. Again, it's a way to manipulate your calories at the end of the day. And like I said, by cutting out an entire food group, that you're limited on what you can have to eat. But like I said, if you're not careful with your fat sources, you can easily overconsume calories on a ketogenic diet, right? If you're just getting really fatty meats, a ton of cheese, a ton of butter, a ton of oil, like that, those can add up quickly, and you might not feel like you're eating a lot of food, but you can end up consuming extra calories. So it can be a way to manipulate calories, but it can also impact it as well too. So that's my thoughts on keto diet. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this gave you more insight. Obviously, if you have something maybe you don't agree with, you need clarification on, you can always reach out to me on Instagram, which if you aren't following me yet, make sure you do. Jeff, HOE. I have my free masterclass on body recomp, what it is, how to do it. The link to that is in the show notes. I also have my free masterclass on nutrition periodization. I go over each nutrition phase, how to set it up, common mistakes, adjustments, literally everything you need to know about each nutrition phase. And then, if you have questions on if the keto is right for you, how to make it work, can you do more carbs in a fat loss diet, then my free 30-minute strategy call is for you. We dive into what your goals are, where you want to go, and then we talk about how we can get you there. So if you're interested in that, the link is in the show notes. That's it for this episode. I'll chat with you next time.